Hello, 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 chat. J'espère que vous allez bien. J'ai vu la vidéo là. Un cheater qui sabotage un tournoi. Donc celle-là, on va la regarder. On va regarder s'il n'y a pas d'autres sympas. Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres trucs sympas? Est-ce qu'il y a des trucs sympas? Est-ce qu'il y a des trucs sympas? Hmm. Ouais. Bon, on va déjà regarder celle-là. On verra après. On verra après s'il y a des choses.
There's cheating, and then there's what this player did. They were talented, successful, and beloved, and they wound up going to extreme lengths to rig and sabotage a major tournament of over 500 players. The biggest cheating scandal ever, with the most offenses ever committed in any Pokemon tournament, VGC or singles. Offenses ranging from match fixing to playing on an alternate account. We're going to explore the tournament that was the site of the cheating, as well as the general online tournament culture, then look at who the player was, the mysterious way the tournament unfolded, the chaos that exploded
Ça doit être un truc de Smogon ou Showdown, ça.
and of course, the how and why of the cheating itself. Our story begins with the tournament itself, the official Smogon tournament.
Ah ouais, c'est le officiel en plus. Ah ouais, non, c'est chaud.
OST was the first and remains the most defining individual tournament on Smogon, and has been since the site was founded over 2 decades ago. The format is simple. There are open signups for a single elimination tournament of standard play, also known as the current generation of OU. It features some of the best, most intense gameplay in competitive Pokemon history, and as it tends to be the case with any tournament, it had its fair share of controversy, but those usually revolved around luck, or so-called undeserved wins. The usual. The only time cheating ever really happened was in the form of ghosting, or telling someone else what to do in their battle. Except this only really occurred in teams tournaments, where players draft teams of players to collectively try to win. The reason OST, like Smogon's other individual tournaments, generally saw less cheating was because there was less incentive. If multiple people cheat to win a team tournament, they all share the win. In an individual tournament, you don't get to share in the win. This is not to say such things didn't happen, but nowhere near the scale of the team tournaments. Since being seen as the best was such a point of pride, the players winning these tournaments wouldn't want their accomplishment tainted by whispers they had gotten there by cheating. Well, until 2015. The official Smogon Tournament's 11th edition saw the most outrageous cheating scandal in competitive Pokemon history. Everything that came before is positively tame in comparison, and a decade later, nothing has matched it, which really is impossible to imagine. OST Gate, as it was named, was a case of such corruption, many wondered if online competitive Pokemon could ever be taken seriously again. And beyond that, many wondered just what would drive someone to cheat this much in the first place.
Attends, mais le mec, il a dû... Il a dû faire un truc de malade. Il a dû faire quelque chose de malade.
No, not blue as in the color, but blue as in Blue Regard Q Kazoo from Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends. Blue joined the competitive scene in Generation 4, quickly becoming established as knowledgeable about the game, an excellent contributor, a well-liked community presence, and even a trustworthy authority figure, rising through the ranks to influential positions of power, most notably tournament director, and the highest moderator position on the site, administrator. Blue didn't have much impact as a tournament player though, but that changed in Gen 5, where Blue, having improved immensely in the shadows, came seemingly out of nowhere to win the Smogon Frontier, a prestigious individual tournament designated official, meaning you earned a trophy on your profile if you won. Official tournaments were the kinds that were taken the most seriously by the best players, and Frontier took it a step further with its gauntlet-style challenge format, so difficult that for some time it was considered unbeatable, or close to it, since you had to beat over 10 of the best players on the site in current generation OU, with a maximum 2 losses allowed. Winning Frontier meant automatic establishment as a top player, but Blue didn't stop there, continuing to put up elite performances in the biggest tournaments for the rest of the generation.
Ah ouais, il monte, hein.
And then Generation 6 came around. In XY, Blue really elevated in both skill and reputation, becoming not just a top player, but a contender for the top player. Unquestionably one of the two single best players around, alongside Blue's friend and rival McMegan. They were head and shoulders among even the other best players of the time. Blue was so highly regarded, they became the most expensive player by far in the Smogon Premier League, one of the team tournaments previously alluded to, where managers bid theoretical credits to draft the team together. Blue cost 40k of the 140k budget allotted to every team. The next most expensive player in the tier, longtime tournament veteran, 6'9" ace Matador, cost 23,000. Beyond being admired for skill, Blue was popular among the community for being polite, intelligent, and well-spoken. Not traits the average competitive player is known for, as well as even flashing an occasional mischievous sense of humor. In competitive Pokemon terms, Blue had it all. However, there were a few things. One, while Blue was unquestionably a top 2 player of the time, Blue was also unquestionably the number 2 to McMegan's number 1. 2, Blue aimed for a feat that was incredibly rare at the time, and remains incredibly impressive even today, a second individual trophy win. Frontier was an incredible achievement, but Blue wanted more. Smogon Tour, which consisted of the 3 most recent generations of OU, was considered by many to be the best individual tournament on the site, and it was the one Blue eyed most fervently, coming close with a couple of semifinals appearances, but unable to make it further. 3, while Blue was considered the second best player of the time, many still considered older players of the Generation 4 era, namely Earthworm and Goki, amongst others, to be the best of all time. In Blue's own words from a public interview,
"My reasons for playing Pokemon have evolved a lot throughout the years. Right now, though, my main reason for playing is to be known as a person people refer to as the best player of my era. There will always be debates regarding who the best player of a certain era was. You usually see similarities in the responses people give. For example, when people discuss 4th generation players, I rarely see anyone mention someone other than Earthworm as the first best player of his era, with others usually being mentioned second."
The full response is much longer, but it was also the polite public answer, going on to mention appreciation, not wanting to sound selfish, being a highly competitive person, and so on. Those who knew Blue in private were familiar with the more openly disdainful version, with clear resentment towards those who rated the players of the past more highly. Also notable in this response was the following.
"Sometimes I wish I was under the radar like I was when I first started playing tournaments, because people don't know what to expect from you, which isn't the case for me anymore."
Not long after this interview, it was early January 2015, when Blue took a tough, luck-influenced loss in the later rounds of the playoffs of the official ladder tournament, coming up short for another trophy, and that appeared to be a sort of last straw, with Blue now looking to be stepping back from playing as seriously. Deflated by the obnoxious tournament community as much as the game itself, Blue chose not to play in the official Smogon tournament that was starting up, instead focusing on tournament director duties by generating some of the tournament's pairing as a neutral, non-participating party. Thus, Blue was off to the side when the year's first real dose of tournament drama started rolling in.
Hello, 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 hello.
In round 2 of
Comment que tu
OST,
vas?
Crash and Boom Bang, or CBB, another top player and close friend of Blue's, lost. Losing is one thing in a game like Pokemon where anything can happen, making upsets relatively common. But what made it so notorious was the way he lost. Not only did he lose to a completely new player nobody had heard of named Style, he got utterly
Je sais pas du tout, je connais pas. C'est du 1v1 donc je connais pas du tout. Je connais pas. Ils disent qu'il s'appelle Blue. Blue et il fait des 1v1. On va faire juste ça. Ah, c'est une meuf? Je sais pas.
He was notorious for using fast-paced offensive teams and had chosen to mix it up with the defensive squad instead.
Pas du tout.
The odds of this coming together so seamlessly in this particular game was quite extraordinary, but it wouldn't have amounted to anything more than a week's gossip had it not been for what happened again and again. In round 3, Style faced off against another experienced player, Blue Wing, and once again won in 2 games, with another effortless sweep with a set that was even more obscure. Cotton Guard Dragon Dance Mega Altar.
Cotton Guard Dragon Dance. C'est pas mal ça.
In round 4, Style faced off against another veteran tournament player and friend of Blues, BKC, and the Mega Altaria thing happened again. Suddenly, the player base was abuzz. How did this keep happening? all eyes were officially on this newbie knocking off experienced players in grand style over and over.
Après, si je regarde ça,
With
je
Radiant
connaîtrais
Hero
déjà l'histoire.
156 as the opponent, saw Styles' most absurd niche strategy take another unstoppable 6-0, with Nasty Plot Mew baton passing into Mega Ampharos against a hapless stall team. Some among the baffled player base started coming up with conspiracy theories, namely that Style was an alternate account of an experienced player. But these theories were also mostly thrown around in a joking manner. Mostly. What really fed into the hysteria was the fact that Style was a woman, and the player base at the time was pretty much as close as being to 100% male without actually being 100%, as well as having the famous online gamer maturity level that automatically casts suspicion against anyone claiming to be a woman. Though there had been a few players that had pretended to be women before, but there had also been women players as well, rarer though they were on account of the boys club that the internet was for so long, which meant a lot of unwanted attention and even harassment from the especially immature users on the site. Interestingly though, among the few women players was Cholena, who was actually the winner of the first ever official Smogon tournament back in 2005, in the Gen 3 days.
La pub, monsieur, la pub.
This, of course, has absolutely nothing to do with Pokemon and shouldn't have any bearing on how someone is treated, and the player base has become much more inclusive in more recent years. But at the time, it did play a major role in ramping up the intensity of watching Style continue her rampage through the tournament. She reigned in the crazy stuff for round 6 and 7, but in the semifinals, against YouTube superstar Thunder Blunder, out came the Pursuit Mega Aerodactyl and the non-choice Hidden Power Electric Keldeo. Not as ludicrous as what had become before, but they and the team they were used on were perfect answers to what Blunder brought. Suddenly, all that was standing between Style and the win was the other finalist, White Queen. And here's where the drama really began. On the surface, Style seemed like a prodigy that has solved the game, like a Pokemon equivalent of a child savant who dominates chess grandmasters. But behind the scenes, some players had begun to have funny feelings about what had been going on. There were a lot of coincidences, and Style didn't seem like who she said she was. This really did seem like an alternate account of some player. But how could anyone pull this off? And just as importantly, who would try to pull something like this off? Some weren't sure who it might be, but they certainly knew that something was wrong. Then there were others who knew exactly who they thought it was. Blue. This would be blasphemous to say in public, as accusing such a top-tier player and well-liked person of pulling off cheating on such an absurd scale seemed ridiculous, and then learning that their friends and others had begun to suspect the same things. So how on earth did all these players start making this connection? Well, Style had become friends with Blue, CBB, and their friend Great Asterd, aka Hugo. They claim to have reached out to Style after being impressed by her games early in the tournament. This is no reason to be suspicious in of itself, but that was just the beginning. Blue was friends, or at least friendly, with most of Style's opponents, and it was against those opponents that Style had used the insanely specific Pokemon that would almost otherwise never work in the exact matchups they needed. Against other opponents in rounds 1, 6, and 7,
Il a pris le truc
Style
parfait
had used
pour les
much more
combiner.
safe standard teams. Their playstyle was a more dependable balance, which was exactly like the kind Blue was famous for using. What's more, Blue had been in contact with said friendly opponents at the time of their matchups with Style. Blue had offered help with their teams, as was normal to do with your friends. You'd help them prepare for their tournament games, and they'd do the same with you. It was even normal at the time to talk breezily about the game with your friends as it happened, but not in the asking for advice sense, but just as a form of commentary. So it didn't seem strange that Blue would ask Styles' opponents what moves they were planning on making. But with this information at hand, the theory clicked into place. Blue had not only gotten the teams from Styles' opponents, but knew exactly when in the best of 3 they would be used, allowing the absurdly specific, can't possibly lose counter team to work and not fall flat on its face as it would against anything else. And to really make sure the win was guaranteed, Blue would even ask the opponent what moves they were making. After all, who would think such a respected authority figure and close friend would be conspiring to create such humiliating losses?
C'est chaud là.
Oh, and remember, Blue had been responsible for making some of the pairings for the tournament, specifically those for the pairings with Blue Wing, BKC, and Radiant Hero 156, which had featured the most ludicrously specific counters. BKC had also noticed that in the second game, the one turn he didn't tell Blue what move he would make was the one turn Style seemed to not know what he was going to do, regardless of how good the move was. Blue Wing also noted not really having talked to Blue much before, which made it all the stranger when Blue reached out to quote-unquote help for the round 3 games against Style. So this conspiracy made sense on paper. Blue was Style. Though theoretically Style could be a real person that Blue was helping cheat, but that thought didn't cross anyone's mind, since Blue would clearly be looking for personal gain and not pulling off the biggest cheating ever for someone else. Either way, there was no evidence. Plus, as suspicion towards Blue grew, there were those that jumped to Blue's defense. Would Blue of all people really cheat? And not just cheat, but cheat in this unprecedented extent. Well, the answer to that was
le mec,
yes.
il a deux comptes, un pour savoir pour savoir vu que tous les moves, vu qu'il est admin ou je sais pas quoi, un truc comme ça. Et l'autre pour jouer. C'est ça.
This was investigated, but suddenly a log of the battle was produced and the controversy was covered up. Of course, even back then, there had been a few who knew that the game had been a fraud. It was even publicly alluded to, albeit cryptically. See Goki's post calling Blue the fraud champ, and then congratulating the actual wins, and then Reach Zero leaving a message on Iconic's wall saying the only reason he hadn't infracted him was because he couldn't give him the kind that never expired. So yes, some of these players said, I absolutely can believe that Blue would cheat. There was also Blue's lesser-known, unproven, but strongly suspected involvement alongside several others in a case of impersonation and team stealing in the World Cup of Pokemon Finals the following year. There were similar rumors of Blue having received ghosting help when playing in the Smogon Premier League, despite costing a record amount. But simply, it didn't seem that strange that Blue would do this.
Okay.
The community really started fracturing once legendary rabble-rouser and blunder associate CTC made a controversial post that voiced many concerns. And you didn't have to know CTC did it.
Le mec, en vrai, pour faire ça, il faut avoir des connexions. Le mec, il avait toutes les connexions, il avait tout ce qu'il fallait. Il a préféré tricher.
And on the other side, there were those that thought Blue was clearly up to something. And some of the latter camp went too far, not gonna lie. An unofficial task force of Blue doubters nicknamed the Scooby Gang was formed after the Round 4 series that had prompted the first wave of conspiracy theorists that were suddenly looking a lot more credible in retrospect. Funnily, Style had defended herself, giving her backstory as having gotten into the game through clubs at school, Stony Brook University in New York.
Ils n'ont pas dit que justement c'était un mec qui se faisait passer pour une meuf.
Even contacted the owner looking for someone named Sabrina, which was the name Style had given. This was, of course, a horrifying violation of privacy, but they wound up not finding anyone by that name. However, this still didn't prove anything. Style and Blue's IP addresses didn't match either. Blue was known to be from California, but that didn't surprise anyone. There was one thing even the most suspicious of Blue couldn't quite figure out, though. What's the motive? That's what many defended Blue with. What does Blue actually gain from this? Those suspicious of Blue were in agreement that the goal was clearly for Style to win the tournament and become a top player. However, it can't be revealed that it was Blue because then the result is nullified. So is this just Blue's new account? A new account doesn't require cheating, but does take some time to get established in the tour scene. So was this just a way to speedrun that? Or what if it was revealed to be Blue as some way of proving that they were better than McMegan or all of those old Gen 4 players? Of course, this would seem hollow, seeing as it was accomplished through cheating. But then if it wasn't revealed to be Blue, the perception would be that Style was this prodigy who came out of nowhere and schooled everyone to unprecedented degrees. The player Blue most wanted to topple, Earthworm, had made many battlers, even great ones, look silly in his dominant rise to the top. He seemed like an unstoppable robot at times, impervious to mistakes, but even he had never humiliated so many of the game's best to such degrees, over and over, with such ludicrously genial specificities. To be perceived as ahead of even Earthworm seemed like enough reward. The possibilities were enough to make your head spin, but the evidence was missing, until finally it wasn't. Even further behind the scenes, the tournament director CL, and funnily enough McMegan, had been conducting an internal investigation into Style. It was long and complex, but here's the gist. Someone anonymous claimed to be a longtime Pokemon player and friend of Style in real life, being willing to physically meet people to prove it. This anonymous friend claimed to have helped Style in the early rounds of the tournament and even shared the account with her. This wasn't allowed, but was minor in the grand scheme of things. McMegan and CL thus asked for more information about Style, and long story short, both Style and her friend mentioned they had a Google document which they used to prepare for her games. Seeing as this document could potentially clear Styles' name, McMegan asked for and received full access to it. The doc seemed to have useful information, but McMegan checked the revisions tab, and the oldest revision was from March 16th, aka the 5th round of the tournament, not the very beginning of the tournament, which had been in January. This document thus proved nothing, and it was only after this discovery that McMegan was then told that the information in this document had actually been moved there from an original older one, whose revision timestamps, which cannot be manually tricked, were supposed to go back to the beginning of the tournament. McMegan asked for access to this document, but was refused on account of it containing details of Style and her friends' personal lives. This was accepted as a legitimate reason, but even beyond this, there were more issues. None of the information Style and her friend provided actually proved they were legitimate. They actually led to more suspicious coincidences coming to light. McMegan asked Style for paste spins of all her teams, and the paste spin of her round 1 teams was linked to another paste spin, which happens when you use the clone this paste feature. What was in the paste spin her round 1 teams had linked to? Well, the team that CBB used against her in the Hidden Power Fire Manaphy game, of course. There was also a link between Style and another publicly unnamed player in the form of Hostmask on Internet Relay Chat, or IRC, the default chat program in the days before Discord. Technicalities aside, it's not the kind of thing you can fake by changing your IP. With all these incredibly suspicious coincidences, the active withholding of the crucial evidence in the previously mentioned Google Doc that could have potentially validated the matches having been played without cheating was thus considered jurisdiction for disqualification from the tournament. Style was DQ'd from the finals. A bracket recreation was done instead, leading all Style's opponents to play each other. In the end, the winner was White Queen, the one player who had
폰 두고서 디자인이 너무 예쁘잖아. 이걸 혼자서 했다고?
hadn't played Style. Some players thought it was strange how accepting Style was of the decision. After all, if you were a legitimate player and were DQ'd under such circumstances, it would be the mother of all meltdowns. But shortly afterwards, Blue came forward and admitted to helping Style cheat. And shortly after that, they admitted Blue was in fact Style. More evidence previously kept secret by McMegan and CL eventually came to light. The new Google Doc didn't have any copy and paste, but was instead a complete forgery. And the old doc had never existed. Though there were also attempts made to fake its existence, CL also managed to gain access to the round 5 teams, namely the nasty pass to Mega Ampharos, which induced EV spreads that were utterly preposterous. The Mega Ampharos had agility, and yet not enough speed EVs to outrun something as basic as base 100 speed Pokemon like the Mega Charizards. Instead, it was just fast enough to naturally outspeed everything on Radiant Heroes team except Cresselia, which it couldn't outrun unboosted anyway. While it seems strange for an innocent person to lie and forge evidence, and to use such an absurd team right down to the EV spread, there was still no clear link to Blue. But remember that IRC hostmark? Yep, the user that shared it with Style was in fact Blue.
Hi.
However, the confession was a spotlight, because the paste spins Blue posted finally revealed the motivations behind the whole affair. Long story short, everyone had assumed Blue was a man, as was the default in those days. But Blue now revealed that she was a woman. She had also become overwhelmed with the pressure that came with being such a top player, with such high expectations from herself and everyone else. In an attempt to get away from that pressure, as well as being able to play with her true female identity, she created Style in hopes of being able to retire the Blue name and the baggage that came with it. Why the cheating? Well, because it would have led Style to being accepted in the tournament scene. Style and Blue were both permanently banned for the absurdly long list of offenses committed that include match fixing, abuse of admin privileges, offering assistance under false pretenses, illegally obtaining information on the moves that their opponent was going to make, and entering with an alternate account. There is much to be seen in the story of Style. The immense pressure of the tournament scene, exacerbated by the immense hostility and immaturity of the boys club at the time, that made one of the most prominent players even hide their gender for over half a decade. Of course, there were some that were suspicious of even this, knowing Blue's incredibly manipulative nature, especially since after the reveal, there was an outpouring of sympathy and even some calls for forgiveness. Those who had to play Style, though, were less big-hearted, as they had been so thoroughly deceived, and had been subjected to abject humiliation on the big stage in front of their community and peers. There's cheating, and then there's this. In a way, it's the ultimate mystery, because there's no way of knowing for sure. What we can focus on is simply what we do know for sure, and the rest is to decide for ourselves. And thank you so much
Ok,
to our
merde.
platinum patrons.
Les gars, il y a un truc qui vient d'arriver. Je dois y aller, je suis vraiment désolé. Je suis vraiment désolé. Désolé. Je vous laisse là-dessus, je vous dis à toutes. Bisous, ciao. Bonne soirée à vous.